Hello dear students, welcome to another lesson of our educational channel which is intended for grade 11 students. In this lesson we are going to talk about literature time, that is the story at the end of your books. Today we are going to talk about David Copperfield, the events that form the story and the morals behind these events. So please stay with us after this break and we'll be back. Welcome back, dear students. As I said earlier, we are going to talk about literature time and some set book questions which are related to the story David Copperfield. Before we start the lesson, it's very important to know why we study literature. Okay? Why do we have stories in addition to our regular lessons in our books? Well, simply because when we teach literature time, our aim is for you to increase your confidence when approaching literary texts. After all, school is not the end in your life. You need to proceed with your future life, and probably you will read some novels or stories either in Arabic or in English. And when you read, you feel or you increase this confidence reading in different languages. And also to acquire general knowledge about the world. When you read a novel or a story, you get information about how life in general is. And you get knowledge about events or about things that happen to people in different contexts and how they react to these situations. So it's, in general, it is knowledge about the world. And also it improves your language. When you read literature, you improve language. You learn new words, new expressions, and how to express your ideas. Also, it builds your critical thinking. When you read a piece of literary work, you analyze it. You read it with a critical eye. And you appreciate literary work. At least you can say, this book is better than the other. This book is worth reading and this book is not. And also, it develops your problem-solving skills. When you read, it helps you to solve problems in your life. Also, it helps you use creative imagination, because when you read, you imagine the situation, and this broadens your imagination. And it also helps you to think independently. When you analyze a piece of writing, you do it on your own. So you build this thinking independently. All right? So there are many reasons why you have to read literature. And the least is for your own enjoyment. Don't forget this. Okay. Now, in order to study a piece of literary work, you need to remember a few things. Elements of literary analysis, you have to include things like, we have the plot, which is a sort of summary of the events of the story. And then the setting, that is the time and place where the story takes place. And then we have genre, which is the type of literature. Is it fiction or non-fiction? Point of view simply means, is the story written in the first person singular or third person singular? That is, when you read the story, does the writer say I or he? This is what we mean by point of view. And then we have characters. How many characters and who are these characters? Who are the main characters? Who are the secondary characters? And then the order of events. Does the writer use a progressive order, or does he use what we call flashbacks? So all these elements should be considered when we read a piece of literature. Well, of course, we are going to apply this to our story. But there are a few other things that you have to know when you read a story. There is what we call themes. Each story or novel has a theme or multi-themes. A theme is simply the main idea that weaves the story together, the underlying ideas of what happens in the piece of literature, often a statement about society or human nature. In short, the theme is the message of the story, what the writer wants to convey to his readers. And most of these themes talk about society and human nature. We have explicit theme and implicit theme, and as their names imply, explicit theme is when the writer states the theme openly and clearly, and implicit theme is when it is implied, that is, embedded in the events of the story. So there can be multiple and secondary themes in a story. Let's apply these things to our story, and it is of great importance to talk about the writer himself. Who is Charles Dickens? Because if you understand the writer, you can understand his writing and what he means when he says or when he writes these things. Now, the writer is Charles Dickens, who was born in 1812, so it is in the 19th century. And he spent the first 10 years of his life in Kent, a marshy region by the sea in the east of England. So he lived in an open area near the east of England, and this will be reflected in his story. And his father's financial irresponsibility placed him in enormous debt and caused tremendous strain on his family. This shows that his father did not manage his finance wisely, and finally fell into troubles and ultimately had to go to prison. This will also be clear in the story. He had to work in order to earn money for the struggling family. As you notice, these things about the writer will be similar to the events in the story. For example, his father did not manage his finance wisely, and the fact that Dickens had to work to earn money for the family. These things are similar to what happened to David Copperfield. His childhood experiences inspired passages in David Copperfield. This is what I was saying. Let's also talk about Charles Dickens's other works, which include Oliver Twist, and some of you may be familiar with this novel, and it was filmed many times. And we have Nicholas Nickleby and A Christmas Carol, and his best well-known novel was Great Expectations, which shares many thematic similarities with David Copperfield. That is, if you read Great Expectations and David Copperfield, you will find some similarities, that is, things which look alike. Now let's talk about the plot, that is, the events of the story. Here I'm going to summarize the main event in the story, and so as to get an idea, and so that we can analyze these events and deduce the morals behind them. Okay? I'm going to show you the summary and make you listen to it. So please pay attention.
Now a grown man, David Copperfield tells the story of his youth. As a young boy, he lives happily with his mother and his nurse Peggotty. His father died before he was born.
So you see, that first we are talking about David Copperfield as an orphan. That is, his father died before he was born, and he had to live with his mother and his nurse Peggotty.
During his early childhood, Peggotty takes him to visit her family in Yarmouth, where he meets Peggotty's brother, Mr. Peggotty, and his two adopted children, Ham and little Emily.
Again, in his childhood, he spent a few days with Peggotty's family, and mainly Ham, and Emily, because these characters will make up the story and they have influence on the character that is David.
After this visit, David attends school at Salem House, which is run by a man named Mr. Creakle. David befriends and idolizes a young man named James Steerforth. David also befriends Tommy Triddles, an unfortunate boy.
Okay, as a young boy, he had to go to school. But for David, he was obliged to go to a boarding school. That is a school where he studied and lived at the same time. And in this school, he had two friends named Steerforth and Tommy. And it mentions that one of them was rich and one was poor. It's very important to know who are the rich characters and who are the poor ones and how they interact with the main character.
David's mother dies, and he returns home, where Mr. Murdstones neglects him. He sends him to work for Mr. Quinion and moves in with Mr. Micawber, who mismanages his finances. When Mr. Micawber leaves London to escape his creditors, David decides to search for his father's sister, Miss Betsy Trotwood, his only living relative.
Again, as the events proceed, David loses his mother and he becomes totally an orphan. And he was obliged to work to earn for his living. So he went and worked for Mr. Quinion and lived with Mr. Micawber. And this Micawber was not a successful man. He also mismanaged his business, just like Dickens's father, the writer's father. So you see that the life of Charles Dickens is reflected in the story itself. So Mr. Micawber mismanages his finance, and David had to work the same as Dickens. And then when Mr. Micawber went to prison, David had to look for his aunt, the only living relative, which he did not see for many years.
Miss Betsy sends David to a school and moves in with Mr. Wickfield and his daughter, Agnes. Among Wickfield's boarders is Uriah Heep, a snake-like young man who often involves himself in matters that are none of his business. David graduates and goes to Yarmouth to visit Peggotty.
Okay, now that he meets his aunt, she sends him to a better school because she is a rich woman. And he meets Mr. Wickfield and lives with him and his daughter Agnes. Among the people that live with Mr. Wickfield is someone called Uriah Heep. Now this person is a villain, that is a bad character. In other terms, when we talk about protagonists and antagonists, or the villain and the good character, Uriah Heep is a bad person. And here he is described as a snake-like who interferes in things that are none of his business. David graduates and goes to Yarmouth to visit his nurse Peggotty. Now this was a short summary of the events that are mentioned in the 3 episodes in your story. Now that we have a clear idea about the events, let's see what's hidden behind these events. Remember, David was a small boy, he had to work, and he lived with a poor family, and then he looked for his aunt, Mrs. Betsy, who sends him to a good school, and he studies law, and he became a law clerk. So, after all this, what can we say? What is the major conflict or what is the major problem in this story? If you think of the events, what is David's problem? Simply we can say that David struggles to become a man in a cruel world with little money and few people to guide him. From his early age, he had to depend on himself. Sometimes he found people who helped him, other times he had to work on his own. So this is the major conflict, that is trying to prove yourself and to be a man in a society which is full of cruel people. Now, for the themes, we have the plight of the weak. What we mean by the plight, that is the difficulties or the hardships of the weak, of the poor. Throughout David Copperfield, the powerful, that is the rich people, abuse, mistreat the weak and helpless. That is, rich people mistreat poor people. This is what happened in the story, okay? And we are not talking about the present time, but we are talking about some things that happened in the past and are described in this story. Dickens, that is the writer, focuses on orphans, women, to show that exploitation is the rule in an industrialized society. So at that time, in the 19th century, society was worse than it is now, because rich people exploited the poor people. Dickens, that is the writer again, draws on his own experience as a child to describe the inhumanity of child labor. Okay? So, if we want to talk or describe the story, it's very important to remember these things. That is, child labor, poor people, rich people, etc. Now we have another theme, which is wealth and class. Wealth and class, that is, rich people and their class in society. Throughout the novel, Dickens criticizes his society's view of wealth and class as measures of a person's value. That is, at that time, society valued people who were rich. Okay? Dickens uses Steerforth, that is his friend in Salem School, who is wealthy, powerful, and noble, to show that these traits are more likely to corrupt than improve a person's character. He wanted to say that people who were rich were or had the possibility to become cruel because of their richness. On the other hand, Mr. Peggotty and Ham, both poor, are generous, sympathetic characters. So, in the eyes of the writer, people who were rich were bad people, and people who were poor were good people. Do you agree or disagree with him? Well, this will come in the next section when we are going to ask you to comment on these events. Many people in Dickens's time believed that poverty was a symptom of moral immorality and that people who were poor deserved to suffer because of inherent deficiencies. At that time, they thought that people who were poor, they deserved to be poor. Dickens, on the other hand, sympathizes with the poor and implies that their sadness results from society's unfairness, not their own failings. So he wanted to express his own opinion on his society, to emphasize or to show that poor people were poor not because of their inherent inabilities, but of the unfairness of the society where they lived. Now, it's time to discuss the story in your own ideas. That is, what do you think of the things that we discussed earlier? The first question says, David suffered a lot after the death of his parents. In your opinion, why do we need a family? So without a family, David suffered a lot, and that's clear in the story. So what is the importance of family in your opinion? Okay? Of course, you can say many things, but you need to arrange your ideas and put them in comprehensive sentences, at least 3 sentences, which is required from you in your exams. So as a sample answer, we can say, everyone needs a family to lead a happy life. If you want to be happy, you need a family. Without a family, you are not happy. Family members, especially parents, provide us with care, security, and affection. These things are essential for our good being. If you want to be a healthy person, you need to have enough care, security, and affection. And last, family is the source of happiness. Of course, this is just a simple answer. You can come up with better ones. All you need is to think of the importance of your family in your life. Another question, David was obliged to work at an early age. What do you think of child labor? This is a big question. That is, what do you think of children who work at an early age? Is it a good thing? What should governments and societies do against this? Should we encourage or ban these things? Well, personally, it's not a good thing for a child to work, right? All countries, all societies are against child labor because simply I think it should be banned, that is eliminated. We should eliminate child labor from society, or it should be banned. Children need to enjoy their childhood, go to school and learn. So for a child, the right place is school, okay? Not work. Child labor is a kind of child abuse because employees exploit them and give them little money. So child labor is something which is or which has to be banned from every society. This is my opinion, and it's free. You are free to express your own opinion concerning child labor. Remember, this also could be an essay question. That is, you can write pages on this question. Another question, David went to different schools and seemed to like the last one. What makes a good school for you? In the story, David went to 2 different schools, okay? And he seemed to like the last one. So why do you think people or students like schools? Or in other terms, as the question says here, which or on what basis would you prefer this school to another? What makes a good school in your opinion? You can talk about a good school should be well equipped, about the equipment, the building, the facilities. Teachers must be friendly, about the types of teachers. And the curriculum should be up to date. That is, the information or the school subjects that you learn at school should be up to date and beneficial to you in your future life. So again, it's a free question which can be answered in different ways, and it only concerns the person who answers it. That is, you can say whatever you think makes a good school. And another question, how should the rich treat the poor? Again, this is a question which is very open, and of course, in questions like this, 3 sentences will be enough. So, how should the rich treat the poor? You can answer this question, for example, as an example, helping the poor is one of the teachings of Islam. As Muslims, we should care for the needy. We should sympathize with them and try to help them overcome their difficulties. So you see that the answer is general. That is, without having detailed information about the story, you can answer the question. But if you can relate this question to the story, then you will be an outstanding student. For example, you can talk about how Miss Betsy Trotwood helped her nephew David, how she sent him to a good school, how she spent a lot of money on his education. In parallel, you can talk about how David helped Mr. Micawber. Although David was a child, He helped Mr. Mikober, who was an old man, by selling his belongings to help the family. So we have different examples either in life or in stories. That was all for this lesson. I hope you have enjoyed it and learned a lot of things about David Copperfield, and you are now motivated enough to go back and read it again and in more details. Until then, I wish you good luck and hope to see you another time. Thank you very much.